been a weekend of superlatives at the same time as seeing the largest aerial assaults from the Russian military on Ukrainian cities. We're also seeing the largest prisoner exchange between the two countries. Now, starting with the positive, we did see over 3 days, Friday, Saturday and Sunday, a total of 2,000 prisoners being released, 1,000 Russian, 1,000 Ukrainian. Now, this did happen, as I say, over 3 days. We have been seeing some very emotional reunions, some very emotional images on the Ukrainian side as those coming off from buses draped in the Ukrainian flag are reunited with their loved ones. In some cases, they have been held prisoner for a number of years. Now, we did hear from the Ukrainian leader, Volodymyr Zelensky, thanking everybody involved in this process.
The task is to bring home absolutely everyone who is currently held in Russia. And this is a joint task for our intelligence services, for our diplomats, for our entire state. Clearly, it's not an easy task, but it must be accomplished. I'm grateful to everyone around the world who is helping us.
Now, according to the Ukrainian Prisoner of War Centre, this is the 6th prisoner exchange that we have seen this year alone, and it is the 65th overall. And yet, at the same time as seeing something as positive as this, we also saw a devastating weekend when it came to the aerial assaults on Ukraine.
81 co-sponsors, in addition to the two sponsors, on a bill that would put sanctions on Russia. This can be done. The American people support Ukraine and oppose Putin. The Senate is in strong position to put these sanctions on. That's what can be done. No, it is not hopeless.
If the U.S. doesn't provide more weapons, then the onus is largely going to be on Europe. Does it have the ability to do more, to go it alone, so to speak, to help Ukraine?
It turns out that some 40% of the weapons being used on the battlefield right now coming from Ukrainians, coming from Ukrainian factories. 40% are Ukrainian-made weapons. 30% coming from the Europeans and 30% coming from the United States. So the Ukrainians are stepping up their ability to provide these, as are the Europeans. But you're right. Europeans do not have the military industrial complex, the defense industrial base, in order to provide the kinds of equipment that the Americans have provided. So the Europeans are willing to buy from the United States, from U.S. arms manufacturers, weapons for Ukraine. So that can happen. We just have to give them the okay to do that.
All right. And Ambassador Bill Taylor, always a great pleasure having you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Frederica.
I think several things came out of it. The first thing that came out of it was that he said it was positive talks. They're going to continue. He thinks the two should get together and talk more specifically. Also said that he thought that Vladimir Putin did want peace, but the war, of course, still going on. And the question is, of course, whether in fact that is the case or not. And if he does want peace, Vladimir Putin will not want peace out of the goodness of his heart. He'll want peace because, well, first of all, there's the economic drain with this, not only this war and sanctions, also the price of oil plunging the way it has. He may, and of course, the casualties that just keep piling up. I suspect he even knows that continuing this war in the same manner that it's been fought over the past 2 years is just not possible for either side. But again, right now, the negotiations continue. To talk about that, let's bring in NBC News Chief International Correspondent Keir Simmons from Dubai. Also retired U.S. Army Lieutenant General Mark Hertling. His military career spans more than 3 decades of service, including as the Commanding General of U.S. Army Europe and the 7th Army. Keir, let's begin with you. What can you tell us about the call yesterday and Russia's response?
Well, Joe, just to underscore what you've been saying, here's the point. President Putin does want the war to stop on his terms. That's what he said again and again. He walked out of that call yesterday, went straight in front of the cameras, Russian state media, and said it again. We want our core interests to be addressed. The root causes, he calls it, By that, he means he doesn't want Ukraine any closer to Europe. He doesn't want Ukraine. He wants Ukraine to be mostly neutral. All those things that we've heard again and again. That call that President Trump had with President Putin did not change that. President Trump says that he may back away. He's already backing away. He was said just days ago that the only way to solve this was a face-to-face meeting between him and President Putin. Now, apparently, that isn't going to happen for some time, while there are direct talks between Russia and Ukraine. President Zelensky and the Europeans are very, very worried about a particular question. What does backing away mean by President Trump? Does that backing away mean that he just leaves the negotiations to Russia and Ukraine? Or does backing away mean that he withdraws again intelligence support for Ukraine, this kind of security support that the Europeans just can't provide? Now, this is a very fast-moving, complicated picture. There are lots of things happening. There's a bill in Congress that Secretary of State Rubio said over the weekend the White House is not able to prevent the progress of, that would really enforce tougher sanctions and more sanctions on the Russians. The White House approved the moving of Patriot missile defense systems to Ukraine just in the past few weeks. So what President Trump says and what's actually happening, just like in his first term, are not necessarily the same. And in some ways, we're seeing a repeat of that first term. It's like the bromance is back on. What the Russians said about the call was that President Putin began by congratulating President Trump on the birth of his grandchild, that they called each other by their first names, that they didn't want the call to end. The two presidents wanted to just keep going. So all very friendly, but no prize. So sort of, friends with no benefits, if you like. And that is a repeat, frankly, of what the Russians think happened in the first term, which was that they seemed to have a great relationship between their presidents, but didn't get any kind of resolution in the relationship with the United States. So we are no further forward. President Putin has not shifted. Despite Steve Witkoff saying over the weekend that the force of President Trump's personality would shift the logjam, was his words. That didn't happen on the call yesterday, and I think the historians may look back on this moment and say this was the moment that the US did begin to step back. It's interesting to hear Steve Witkoff talk. He will say, well, it's a really complicated war. It's very difficult to solve. You think? It's very similar to what he says about Gaza. It's really complicated. It's really hard to stop that war, even though that was his role. There are still hostages being held. And now, of course, Steve Witkoff is moving on to negotiate the Iran deal. So there are, I think we're clearer at this stage, honestly, when you look past the rhetoric about where things stand. I think the war continues. There's no sign of a ceasefire. And both the Russians and Ukrainians will continue to work to try to get what they want from the White House, while certainly the Russians and to some extent the Ukrainians believe they can still gain if the conflict continues. Because the Russians think they're winning, even though there's not a doubt about that when you actually look at the battlefield. And the Ukrainians think that over time, the Russians will begin to struggle to supply more troops to the military, more recruits to the military. So far, they're really able to still funnel troops to the military, but that may not be the case in years to come. It's going to take some time, though. It's bitterly disappointing, honestly, for anyone who would hope to see peace in Ukraine.
Friends without benefits. Many things have been said of the Putin-Trump relationship. Keir, you added one to the top of the list. Friends without benefits.
So Saturday, President Zelensky met with the leaders of France, Britain, Germany, and Poland, and they agreed that there should be a demand to Russia for a ceasefire with negotiations then to follow, but that if Russia did not quickly agree to a ceasefire, that there would be harsher Western sanctions. And they had a phone call then a week ago Saturday with President Trump. He agreed to that. That was the position. On Sunday, Putin says no to a ceasefire. I'll do direct negotiations. And President Trump flips to that. So I think there's a concern, is the White House going to be consistent here? But what I think Putin is trying to do, he does not want a ceasefire. He has rejected the administration's proposal back in March for a ceasefire. What he wants to do instead is to have direct negotiations, but that's going to be a mechanism that allows the Russians to simply bog the talks down in details for months and months and months while they continue military operations. And this is why I think it's important that if the president really wants to try to bring an end to this war, he needs to start penalizing Russia for its bad behavior and make it clear that the costs to Russia are going to escalate if Russia does not get serious about a ceasefire and a negotiation.
Look, Jeff, President Trump said on the campaign trail that he was going to end this war in his first 24 hours in office. He's repeatedly called for an end to the violence that's unfolding there in Ukraine. What kind of political pressure is he under to make a deal to end this conflict?
I would say it's significant political pressure, in large part because he sort of set the terms for it. Donald Trump has basically made the case that only he can be the one to influence Vladimir Putin. He's not the first American president to believe that through the sheer force of personality or charisma or magnetism that might somehow yield a desired outcome. But Vladimir Putin has shown for years now that he is not willing to give up this protracted war. And even during the Biden administration, the view was that Ukraine would not win this war in a conventional sense, that this would be a negotiated end, and that the goal was to give Ukraine the resources, the military intelligence, the military resources it needed to have the most leverage and to have the best seat at the table. And to the ambassador's point, you could argue that the Trump administration, by vacillating, has undermined Ukraine's position. And by J.D. Vance even saying today, ahead of the talks, that the U.S. is prepared to walk away. Well, that certainly strikes fear in the heart, I would imagine, of not just President Zelensky, but European countries all around the world.
You know, I think Zelensky's right that, like, Trump's silence is complicity, right? And it's helping to encourage Putin. Putin's got to have something. I mean, these leaks that we're getting really tell us that, like, he has to have something on Trump. Because, like, the U.S., what's the U.S. getting out of this? With that slogan, like, you know, friends with benefits? Well, these are friends without benefits, right? Like, what's Trump getting from this? Like, I'm actually asking. I don't know. Like, money, like, is he making some deal under the table? Like, with Qatar, he might allegedly get an airplane. With some countries, he's getting business deals. And then with others, it's like, you know, maybe you get a trade deal out of it. And it's a very, you know, like, if he makes a deal with China, you could see, like, okay, he's getting something from this. Like, cheaper products for the country, and that leads to a better economy, and then his poll numbers go up, and his party does better, and all of that. It's like, what is he getting out of this? And the only logical explanation, and of course we have no proof of this, the only logical explanation is that Putin has some kind of dirt on Trump. We all heard the rumors of the tapes he might have about Trump in Russia, or the evidence he might have. Like, it's one of the things, there's no proof of it, but it would make a lot of sense if it existed, wouldn't it? Because the only other explanation, and this could be true, is that ideologically Trump supports Putin and his far-right vision.